Welcome everybody to this Instruqt webinar called From Training to Growth, How MongoDB Scales Technical Training. Very excited to have an old friend of the business, old friend of Instruqt, Raghu from MongoDB. Raghu, do you want to quickly do an introduction for yourself?
Yeah, well, Sean, first of all, it's so great to be with you again, and thanks for the time. I really appreciate it. And yes, I've been at MongoDB for about 4 years now, and I run the education department here, and we'll talk much more about it.
Perfect. We're excited to have you. I know you've been on webinars with us in the past. We're excited to kind of connect the dots from the topic you spoke about the last time, which I think was a couple years ago, and maybe follow up on some of those key themes. For those who don't know me, my name is Sean Lauer. I'm the VP of Marketing and Product here at Instruqt. Been here for about a year and a half now. So let's get into a little bit of the agenda. There we go. So agenda, again, we'll just do a quick intro of the different platforms that we're talking about, the different products. We've got a series of questions. Again, we want to really kind of dig into some further discussion, kind of connecting back to what Raghu talked about a couple of years ago and building on what's really happened in those 2 years. And then we will have plenty of time for Q&A. You guys can always ask your questions in the chat. We'll try to get to them live in context. That's always pretty helpful. If not, we will have time at the end to answer questions as well that, maybe they didn't come up as we were going through the specific slides. So plenty of time for that. All right, so a little bit more about Instruqt and MongoDB. So for those who don't know Instruqt, who may be joining us with that sort of lack of familiarity, Instruqt is a developer adoption platform. Our customers really use us to power the software go-to-market process, allowing developers to get hands-on with their products and really get to value more quickly. We'll obviously be digging into some of the use cases for MongoDB and how they're using us across these different areas as well. Raghu, do you want to just kind of give a quick background for MongoDB for those who aren't familiar? Obviously, it's a very, very large company at this point, but I'll let you speak to it a little bit.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. I'm very happy to. So, we at MongoDB are very pleased to be known as a modern enterprise class database platform. We serve about 54,000 customers right now, and we bring in about 175,000 new developers to our platform every single month. So we have a pretty rich ecosystem, and we're very passionate about helping our customers and developers in particular build those next generation modern applications, and using our tool set. And of course, AI is a big part of that. And so that's really, in essence, what we do as a company.
Great. Why don't you tell us a little bit more kind of on the learning side? Obviously, we've just got a couple screenshots here, but MongoDB University and the impact that has.
Yeah, our learning charter is very simple. We want to really reach as many people as we can and train them on MongoDB. Right now, we reach about 1 million learners a month across all of our different platforms that we have. And so the way the department's set up, we have 4 different functions in there. One is documentation, which covers all of our product documentation, and it's a great way to learn about our features and functions of our product. The second department that we have is MongoDB University, and this is where we offer high-quality video-based courses, and built into that learning experience is a hands-on labs capability, which is where Instruqt comes in, and it's a very key partner for us. Along with that, we also have a skills program and a certification program where you can actually earn credentials, and we can celebrate you as someone that's learning the product. So that's a second department. The third area within the education world is academia. And this is where we reach out to colleges and universities. And what we're trying to do there is get professors to teach MongoDB in the classroom, but we're also reaching out to students both inside and outside the classroom, because it's important to realize that the students of today are really the developers and people and work professionals of tomorrow. So getting into that mindset is also important. And then finally, the last department we have is MongoDB Press, which is a collection of technical books that we create. And these are available both in print form form as well as in ebook form. So we really do a lot of different things in the education world, but like I said, the core mission remains the same. We're just trying to reach people where they are and help them learn MongoDB.
Awesome. Yeah. I mean, I think from a maturity perspective, you guys obviously have made significant inroads across a number of channels that you were just talking about. And I think obviously one of the things we'll talk a little bit more about is how you've kind of leveraged education as almost as a go-to-market tool, something that is not siloed within an education team, but something that's leveraged across multiple teams. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. First kind of discussion topic that I'd love to get to, it's kind of maybe connecting back to the topic that we discussed with you a couple of years ago, really kind of more of the strategy behind the content that you were creating back then, and sort of what was the vision for, when you joined the company, what you were really trying to accomplish from an education standpoint?
Yeah, it's a really great question. So what I like to do is remind people always that, learning is really a human experience. And what I mean by that is, we as learners and as human beings learn differently. And so when people ask me to describe the different ways you can learn at MongoDB, the way I like to tell people is that you can read it, which means that you can read our documentation, you can read our technical books and learn that way. You can watch it, which means that you can come to our online video-based courses and learn directly from an instructor. You can try it, where you can actually work directly with the product and learn that way, because some people just like to learn through the keyboard and just learn directly, and we definitely support that. And this is where Instruqt is so critical for us. And then you can also achieve it. And so there are people that like to know that they're going to achieve a skill or they're going to achieve a certification, some type of a credential, and then they back into a learning experience from there. So for us, what was really important is to be best in class in all those different modalities of learning, because that kind of covers the vast majority of people. And along the way, we want to bring in the best in class technologies for each of these things and make that happen. So that was the underlying vision of this. And so for us, we wanted to build that solid foundation of learning, both in terms of the tooling as well as the content and all the offerings out there, and build that really world-class learning experience. And very simply, we just want to be that gold standard in the tech ed space, in terms of just technical software education, which is, what we strive to do.
Awesome. That's great. I think that's a great sort of, like you said, foundation for this discussion, as well as foundation for your program. You mentioned really wanting to bring on, the best in class tech stack. Can you talk us through? I'm sure you've got a number of different platforms you're working with, but can you talk us through maybe some of the core platforms that you guys use as your foundation?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things I like to remind people here too is that, there is no single product that can deliver every aspect of education. When you think about all the modalities and different ways people learn, it is something where you need to integrate some key technologies and bring them together. And in our world, we've brought together 20 different technologies in our overall platform for different use cases. There are 5 big ones. And so the first one, of course, is you need to have an underlying learning management system, something that can hold your content and can deliver the content. And for that, we use Thought Industries. And there are several good platforms out there, and we've been very pleased with our partnership with them. Then the second piece that's really important is some kind of a hands-on lab capability. So this is where learners can do hands-on exercises and interact directly with the product. And so for us, this is where Instruqt has been really critical, and it's been very successful. The third thing I would say is you need to have some type of testing capability for quick testing, quizzing, skill checks, and that kind of thing. And so we use a tool called Scorpion from Cavion, and we've been very pleased with that. The fourth area I would say is some kind of a badging capability where you can recognize learners and let them celebrate their accomplishments and celebrate on social media and all that. And so for us, we use Credly for that one, and that's worked out really well. And then the last big area is our certification technology, and we use a technology called Measure Learning, which is spelled with a Z. And Measure offers proctoring services for high stakes exams where you're vouching for people's capabilities. So I would say that these are the five core underpinning technologies, that really drive most of what we do from a learner experience point of view. Again, there are another 15 odd things that we cobble together to make all this work, but that integration has been really key and to provide all the aspects of learning.
So talk to just quickly how you actually get these to work together. Obviously, there can be a little bit of platform fatigue, but also a little bit of, things might be a little incongruous when it comes to working together. Tell us about how you kind of make sure that everything fits together nicely into one smooth program, or does it? Do you encounter challenges when you're looking to integrate these platforms?
It's a great question, actually. So first of all, we insulate our learners from all this, so our learners have no idea that they're switching between different things. So whether someone comes and watches a video initially and then takes a lab, or someone takes a lab first and then takes a test, all that is very seamless to the learner, and we really make sure that our UI is very clean. Now, having said that, on the back end side of it, we always like to choose technologies that have a very high ability for integration. So good APIs, good connectivity, those types of things are really, really important to us and really governed our choices in terms of what we've chosen. So for us here, I've invested in a small engineering team, and what they do is they help me with these integrations to make sure they happen. And again, all these companies have been great to work with, and we really haven't had any major difficulty, honestly, about it. It's just a matter of having that mindset that, look, you do need to integrate, and it's completely okay to integrate. That's a very normal thing to do.
Yeah, and I also think it's super important, like you're saying, to make it a seamless experience for the learner, because you don't want anybody to have any reason to, drop out from the learning experience because they're frustrated with switching platforms, or they can't get one of the platforms to work. So making it seamless for the learner so they have the easiest experience, and you kind of take the integration to the back end so that they don't have to deal with that.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Awesome. So when you're looking at some of these new platforms, how are you, other than maybe the integration capabilities that we just talked about, how are you actually evaluating and deciding on solutions in general, but then I guess, talk a little bit more about your decision to choose Instruqt?
Yeah, absolutely. So as you correctly pointed out, the integrations is really critical for us, fundamentally, because like I said, some learners will come into Instruqt through our learning management system. Some will come directly into Instruqt and bypass the content completely, which is completely okay. Some people start with a skills-based experience and come into Instruqt that way. So having that ability to enter Instruqt in different ways is really important. So you all have a really good architecture in terms of just the richness of the APIs and connectivity, and that's been huge for us. The other thing I've been really pleased with is just the ability to manage the environments in an efficient way. So whether it's spinning up environments, bring them down, and just being very optimal and efficient about how we use environments has been a really important piece in terms of the technology that we were looking for. That's a second piece that works really well. The third thing I would say is that we're really big about the UI. Having something that's very visually appealing, where you can actually see the product and play with it, but at the same time learn instructions on the side, is very important. So that ability to learn while you're doing is something, or learning in the flow of work, if you will, is really important. And so I felt like the UI that you have is really good. And then the last thing I'll say about this is that, for us, the word hands-on labs is a very generic word. All it means in simple language is that we want you as a learner to access our product and work directly in the product. But what you do with it could be a lot of different things. Something could be very simple, a simple coding example. Something else could be more sophisticated, like a use case, for example, or some kind of an architecture, or maybe something in the vertical market space, something for financial services or healthcare or whatever. So the ability to have that versatility was really important, to provide different use cases and different scenarios in one tool. So for us, I would say that it's that combination of things that really got us to choosing Instruqt.
Awesome. That's great. Let's talk a little bit then, kind of, I think one of the interesting kind of use cases, or one of the interesting evolutions of using Instruqt and hands-on learning in general at MongoDB is how it has kind of scaled across multiple teams. So obviously, when you joined, I think, you were just talking about, you kind of had this vision for more of an integrated program. But I'm curious, as the usage and impact has grown, talk a little bit about how other teams have begun to leverage, whether it's the self-paced learning or even potentially the instructor-led learning that has been created across those different channels that you talked about earlier.
Yeah, I mean, this is a really, really important question. I'm glad you brought it up. So a few things here. First of all, let's start with goals. I think just to state the obvious, I think it's important to have some key goals that govern your business. And in our world, we call these North Star metrics. And what they are is simply 3 metrics that we use consistently at all levels of the organization. So whether I'm chatting with the CEO or the C-suite or any other department in the company, or even with my own team, we always lead with a discussion around, what are the North Star metrics and what do they look like? And we use these as a gauge of the health of our business. And, we also track another 50 different metrics underneath the covers, but it's important to stay consistent at a messaging level with like 2 or 3 key metrics. And so for us in the world of education, there are 3 things. One is I care very much about quality of our content, because I'm a big believer in that if the quality is good, people are going to use it and people will come back. Because, people are very time poor these days, me included. And so our time is valuable. And so having good quality is super critical. So we measure it, we rate it, all that stuff is tracked very carefully. The second thing I would say is that we track the number of learners that we have. And that's a very simple metric. And we want to see how many people are coming through, how they're coming through, and then really track them and make sure they're getting what they need. The third metric for us are the number of people getting skilled or getting certified, because in the end, the outcome of learning, the most visible outcome of learning is some type of a badge or a certification. So knowing that we're increasing those numbers is also healthy for our ecosystem. So I would say that these are the 3 things that I always consistently talk about at every single conversation that I have. And we're very disciplined about it, in terms of as a leadership team. And as I mentioned, we do track a lot of other metrics under the covers, but these are the main ones. Now, in terms of, you brought up the idea of working with other organizations. And so this is really important.
Yeah.
What we try to do really is bring together education and make it available across multiple organizations in the company. And the trick to this is to be able to package up education in a way that appeals to different people. So for example, in the world of customer success, it's all about onboarding, and education is a key piece of that. So if we can get customers quickly onboarded and productively using the product, that's a win. It's a win for them and it's a win for education. In the world of support, for example, there's lots of people calling in, but if we can answer the question for them ahead of time and maybe not have to talk to somebody on the phone, that's a win. And so, you can think of that as call deflection. And again, deflecting in a way that answers the question in a high quality way. And this is again where education comes in. It's a win for support, again, a win for education. I would say the third area, a third good example of this, might be, for example, if you are, in sales and you want to do some kind of pre-sales, you want to get people really going with the product and help them understand it. That's another place where education plays. And a last area probably would be in our consulting organization, where they have, for example, workshops that they do. And so their workshops are solution oriented. And so that's another version of education. So at the end, the nuts and bolts of it are typically courses and content and labs and what have you. But the packaging of this is really important, and packaging it in a way that other people can use it and help them meet their goals is really important. So I always try to really advocate for this idea of let others be successful through education. You can have your own goals, but advocating for others' success is just as important, and that's what we do here.
Yeah, I think that's, kind of meeting people where they are, I think is something that's super important. And, talking in a language that these different audiences will understand and that they care about. I'm curious, this is kind of jumping back, I think, a little bit to the last topic, but you talked about the metrics and kind of socializing the impact upwards. I believe you said you might, maybe with the CEO, really kind of, I think it's an area that maybe a lot of the people listening right now struggle with is sort of getting that sort of buy-in at the executive level. Obviously, these metrics are important and they're valuable and they show the impact, but how did you kind of manage up, if you will, to really kind of highlight the impact that you were having, and then to really lead to getting that maybe top down buy-in to across these teams?
Yeah, it's such a great question. And, at the C-suite level, my messaging has been around recognizing that if our customers are more knowledgeable, what that means is then they're more skilled. And what that means then is that they're using our products more, which in
Mhm.
turn drives the economic engine of the company. Because at the C-suite level, they want to know, and rightfully so, they want to know that their products are being used, our products are being used. And if they're being used, then whether it's revenue or consumption or whatever the metrics are, at the other end of it, are favorable at the end of the day. So my
Mhm.
message for the C-suite has always been about driving that connection point. So really demonstrating that because people are skilled, maybe they're filing less support tickets. Because people are skilled, they are having a smoother onboarding process. Because they're skilled, they're asking us fewer questions. And so having that connection point to really justify, it's not training for the sake of training, it's training for the sake of driving the outcome of consumption and product usage. So when you can establish that connection, that's really, really important. So we really strive hard to look for those integration points, look for those data points that validate that, and use that as the way we get the messaging through. And we've had a very receptive C-suite, around that.
Awesome. That's great. I think your sort of focus on metrics, I think, is probably best in class in terms of measuring that impact. And obviously, anybody who's ever had a conversation with the C-suite knows that they always want to see metrics. So I think that's awesome that you guys are doing that. So another topic that I think our audience probably wants to hear a little bit more about, because we get this question a lot from our new customers, is how did you kind of set up, and maybe you can walk through, I'm sure this has evolved over time, but how have you set up your Instruqt usage from an organizational design standpoint? Like, who manages the platform, who creates content, who has access to what? Obviously, now that the platform is being used across multiple teams, it becomes a little bit more complex. So I'm curious if you can shed a little light and maybe some best practices for the group.
Yeah, I'm happy to. So, the first thing to note is that, the way my group is organized, I have certain very domain-specific leaders that report directly to me. I have one leader who oversees all of my content. I have another leader who oversees our labs and our technical capabilities. I have another leader who runs our engineering team. I have another leader who runs our operations capability, because we need to serve our learners at the end of the day, and being responsive to our learners is really important. We also have a leader for our testing and credentialing programs. So that's both the skills programs, certification programs. And then finally, we have a leader for our enablement programs, because in the end, it is all about the outreach and finding those learners and going into the different markets. And so that enablement leader is also important. So collectively, these leaders really sort of own the overall education experience, in terms of courses and hands-on labs and what have you. So that's step one. Now, step two of this is that we are, as I mentioned in my previous answer, we're building content that really serves the needs of other organizations. So part of that is building the content and building the hands-on lab capability. So as people embrace the content that we have, the labs kind of go with it. And so people start to realize the power and value of Instruqt. And so we've been able to sort of promote Instruqt, from inside out, and kind of get that going across the company. But the flip side has also been true, which is that we have run into some historical teams that have had other platforms, but they like what we have, and they've switched over to Instruqt actually as a result of what we have. So the storyline isn't just about the labs just by themselves. It's the labs combined with the content, combined with the badging, combined with everything else. And that combined solution is really what's gotten people very excited, and being able to build that consistency. And people have realized that Instruqt is best in class in a lot of these things. And so that's how we sort of promoted that.
Now, with these different domain-specific leaders, I'm curious, is there call it like a task force or a kind of how do they coordinate with each other, or did they coordinate through you in order to make sure that everything is connected?
Yeah, so to go along with the structure, we also have a program management function, and they're the ones who basically work with us to come up with smooth and efficient processes. And so
Mhm.
they're kind of the glue that holds everybody together. And we meet very regularly, to make sure that we're all aligned on mission and process and goals and all these things. So for us, that glue, having someone doing program management, project management, however you want to call that, is
Right.
also very, very, very important. So that's how we do
Awesome.
it.
Let's move forward to the next question for us. So obviously, we talked to you a few years ago. You said you've now been enrolled for 3 or 4 years now at Mongo. I'm curious how your approach has changed, not just since the first implementation of Instruqt, but just in general, maybe with how the market has changed, how your audience has changed, and then I guess how has Instruqt played a role sort of as things have evolved?
Yeah, this is such a great question. A lot has changed, as we all know, over the last 3 years. To start on the basics, we did stay true to our core mission of building that best-in-class set of foundational content that we needed to have for us, because what we realized very quickly is that if we don't do that, we don't get to sort of play at the next level. So we did invest very heavily in that and get that going as a core capability. But to answer your question about what has evolved over the last 3 years, one is of course AI, right? We can talk about that, and I think AI has really changed the way we do things just across the board, but it's also changed the way that people assimilate information and people and human behavior, I would say. And so learning is really a big part of that. So an example of this is the summaries that you now see when you go to an engine like ChatGPT, or you go to Google Gemini, for example. So if you type in a
Mhm.
query of some sort, in the old days, and when I say old days, I mean 6 months ago, what you would get is basically like a bunch of blue links, and you get to click on it, your favorite blue link, and go in and dig more and learn what you want to learn. But now what's happening is, these engines are giving you the answers up front, and they're telling you what you want to see. And then if that's good enough, then you don't dig in any deeper. So the whole answer ecosystem has really changed the way that people view information. And we've all seen it, right? We get a quick answer and we think, yeah, that's good enough, and we kind of move on to the next thing. So for us in learning, that's important, because that answer, if it's a technical question, needs to be accurate and it needs to be correct. So we're now at the forefront of making sure that these LLMs, whether it's an answer engine like a ChatGPT, or a search engine like Google, or a coding engine like Copilot, are giving the right information about MongoDB, and that it's visible and accurate and all that. So that's a new frontier of learning. So it's important to recognize that learning is transforming, basically, I would say, through AI. So that's one big change. The
Mhm.
second thing I would say about AI is that it's also changed the way where we think about how we build content. Because again, the old days, and old days again being 6 months ago, because things change so fast now, is that you would build content from scratch. Start with a blank sheet of paper, and then you'd build something out. But now with AI, you can actually get a lot of initial content directly from AI. It'll give you a draft, and in some cases, maybe even a final copy if you're happy with it. So I think recognizing there's content efficiencies and operational efficiencies with AI, I think, is another good thing to sort of recognize. And then the third thing I would say is, there's quite a bit about chatbots and how they interact with learners. And so we're entering into this world of what I would call, conversational learning, where you can just sort of chat with somebody. The somebody happens to be a bot in the AI case, and you can get pretty high quality answers and carry on a conversation and learn that way. So for us, I would say that, I think AI is definitely changed our way of thinking about learning. It's important to recognize that there's a shift that's going on, and we as education groups need to adjust to it. Now, I do want to say that, I feel that content is even more important now than ever before, because it's not that AI just somehow takes over the world and then somehow we don't have to do the other things that we've been chatting about. It's, if anything, you need to double down on it, because
Right.
because you want to make sure AI gives the right information to people. You can't assume that it does. So investing in content to really make it AI friendly is really important. So I like to say, just sort of informally, that we're in the business of training humans and robots, now. And I use robots as sort of an umbrella term for all these things, but recognize that there are humans at the other end of that robot, right, who are looking at whatever they're looking at. So I think that's the single biggest change I would say that's really happened. The other
Yeah.
thing I would say is that the other approach change has been moving from feature function type learning into more solution-based learning. So whether it's architectures, use cases, best practices, things of that nature, I think is an evolution of where we are right now as a department. And but again, that's on the foundation, on based on a solid foundation that we have. So I hope that helps a little bit. It's been a fun journey, honestly, and learning is a highly innovative space.
No, I mean, that's super helpful. I mean, obviously, we talked a little bit about the different channels, or the different channels, like documentation and, the university and books and whatnot. But AI sort of, in some ways, throws a wrench into all of that, but at the same time, it also amplifies all of that and enhances all of that and makes you put a new lens on everything that you've been doing. So, yeah, it's interesting to see that you guys are very deliberately integrating AI into your process, but also into your end user experience.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah, that's great. So I didn't kind of go through this a little bit, but if you want to maybe just talk through how things have evolved, this is a bit of a timeline that we can just talk through at a high level. I can reveal some of these as we're going here. But do you want to just kind of talk through like the way things kind of grew as you joined in 2021?
Yeah, I'm happy to. So turning the clock back to 2021, back then we were in the business of really establishing, that best in class, platform and services that we wanted to offer for education. And as I mentioned, it covered all the different departments, that we talked about. And then a big step in that was choosing Instruqt, of course, as one of our core capabilities that we want to have. And we talked through, the fact that Instruqt really got us much closer to our learners, and we had a much higher connection with our learners because they were playing with the product directly, and they learned that way. So that, and our core audience are developers, and so having that connection through Instruqt actually was really, really important. As we move on to 2023, also, I should say in 2022, we built all the other underlying platforms and content and core capabilities, that we had. And then you can just see some of the numbers there that we have. We've really kind of built, we have a site right now for documentation that's about 25,000 pages. It's a pretty massive site that we have. We have right now multiple labs, hundreds of labs right now, which is really great. And like you correctly said, thousands of learning assets. So we've been really sort of multifaceted in how we build learning, because we recognize, again, different people learn differently. So that kind of took us through 2022, 2023. And as we got into 2024 is when we started to think about, AI, and like we just discussed. And so we have some core AI capabilities in our product, through vector search and all that. So we wanted to make sure our learners knew about that. But then I think beyond that, I think now we're integrating AI, like I said, across the entire learning experience and kind of taking it to the next level. And Instruqt is a big piece of that, because, there's you can learn AI, through our technology and through Instruqt. That's one way to learn it. And then there's also the whole experience, like I said. So it's been a fun journey, over the last 3+ years here, and there's more to come.
Yeah, and I also just want to emphasize, I know we've been talking a lot, I think, about a lot of the self-paced opportunities that you provide, but you also do a good amount of in-person as well. I'm not sure if that necessarily falls under your purview, but I know that within Mongo, there is a good amount of kind of instructor-led training as well that utilizes Instruqt.
Yes, I'm glad you mentioned that, actually, and the answer is yes. So we have self-paced, but we also have live. and we teach live week-long or 2-3 day long courses. And so Instruqt is heavily embedded in that experience. We also do a lot of webinar type things where we can reach customers, and Instruqt is a great exemplar of that. We also do what are called developer days, where we have single day events where people can come in and actually learn about our technology. And the way they learn it, a big part of it is through Instruqt. So there's multiple modalities of how Instruqt is used today, and that's used kind of across the company, both for internal training use cases, but also for external training use cases. And the last thing I should have mentioned is the partner side. We have a big partner ecosystem, and they use Instruqt also to learn about our technology. So there's all these different ways to reach people.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think when I said you guys kind of have a best-in-class integration of Instruqt into your go-to-market, I wasn't kidding. I think you guys are sort of a case study in how to get as much juice from Instruqt as you can. So I think it's great how you guys are seeing that value. So this question also kind of ties to, I guess, our thread earlier on those conversations with the C-suite. But I'm curious how you are actually thinking about, and maybe we can just summarize here what we were saying earlier, but how you're actually thinking about the ROI of the education program, knowing that it has kind of grown into such a multifaceted approach.
Yeah, and I think we touched on this already a little bit, but just to summarize, I think there's a couple of things here. One is we have our own education metrics, as I mentioned before, but we also have, we're also keenly aware of the metrics of other departments in the company. So we understand, for example, how many people call into support, or how many people use consulting services, or how many people are onboarded. So all those kinds of touch points that we have in the company, we're very aware of. So the way we present ROI, it's a combination of our metrics, our 3 North Star metrics that I introduced before, in combination with key metrics that these other departments care about, and having an education flavor to it. So for example, in the world of support, they would talk about the number of cases they closed, and the number of calls they took. It's all pretty typical. But what we have is a metric to go with it that says, by the way, here's the education contribution to that. Same thing with customer success. They talk through how many onboarding sessions they did and how many interactions they had. Again, we have an education metric that says, this is how we connect to those numbers. So aligning to how other people work is really important. And this is something that is important to me. It's not enough just to operate. It's not about them understanding us necessarily. When I say them, being other departments that understanding education, it's really more about education, understanding other people, and so understanding how they work is really important, and connecting the dots that way has been how we've kind of done it.
Yeah. And I also think it's important, when you connect the dots to the things they care about and the work that they're doing, it can help prevent maybe them thinking you're taking credit for the impact that they're having. I think it's showing maybe how education has amplified their efforts as opposed to, replace their efforts, if that makes sense.
It does. Actually, I'm glad you brought that up. Credit can be a thing at times. And so I am very passionate about giving others the credit. I have no issue with that whatsoever. And we almost we bend over backwards to make sure that others get the credit, actually. And because my basic management philosophy is that if they're successful, then we're successful. And people recognize that, and they see that behavior. And so we've been very much at peace with that. And that's a management philosophy that goes with that. And so we've imparted that within our organization.
That's great. Yeah, I'm sure that's very much contributed to a lot of your impact that you've had. So looking forward now, obviously we've been doing a little bit of looking backward for the past few years, and talking a little bit about what's happening today with the AI impact. I'm curious, how are you thinking about the future? I mean, you were joking about how much things have changed in the last 6 months even. What are you doing right now to kind of prepare for the future of technical education?
Yeah, this is such a great question. And I'm very passionate about investing in future methods of learning. So again, learning is a human experience. And so recognize that, understand how people learn in this AI world that we're in is really important. So one, and this is in no particular order, one thing is around this idea of conversational learning that I mentioned before, through chatbots and having sort of a high productive conversation. We have a chatbot today that's LLM based, and we serve thousands of questions a week, answer thousands of questions a week through that. So that's sort of one genre of learning, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
The second genre of learning, I would say, is these answers that I mentioned before, really kind of understanding how the LMs themselves work, and getting an understanding of, for whichever company you represent, is your company even visible in the answer that someone's asking? That's question number one. Question number two is, if it's visible, is it accurate? And the third thing is, how did the LM construct that answer? Because remember, LMs are probabilistic tools, right? So they learn from other places. And so how did they learn, and how did they construct the answer? So having an understanding of that, because again, that information dissemination is another form of learning. It's important to recognize that.
Right.
The other thing that I'm very fascinated about is this is an old expression called personalized learning, and it's an expression that's been around for about 20 years, and it's all about giving people exactly what they want. Another expression for this is just-in-time learning. And what's really fascinating is, there are new tools out there, for example, like Google Notebook, LM, for example. And what it lets you do is it lets you upload any set of videos, any set of documents or whatever, and it will construct a podcast for you, which is just incredible, right? So again, to the magic of AI, it's able to bring together disparate sources of content and then create your own custom experience that you want. So you chose the topics, and then you
Right.
choose the experience, and you control the experience. That level of control we've never had in learning before. Because in the old days, personalized learning was all about providing multiple doors to choose from, and you just choose whatever door you want. And then that somehow was personalized. But now you are literally controlling everything, one at your fingertips, what goes in and what comes out. So I think for me, that's what's exciting about learning. We're trying to finally getting to the point where it's truly an individualized experience. We've never had that before. And I think AI lets you do that.
That's awesome. Yeah, I think just, to your point, obviously AI is the technology that we're all talking about today, but staying on top of how that's changing, and potentially even new technologies that that are coming soon. I think that's probably the best advice that you could give to anybody.
It is. Yeah.
All right, let me find my bearings here in the chapters, or the different sides. All right, so you talked a lot, obviously, about how Instruqt and how hands-on learning kind of plays a role in your current setup. I'm curious if you see that evolving at all, or potential use cases that you're hoping to get to with Instruqt in the future.
Yeah, I do actually. I think technologies like Instruqt are so important, and even more so in the world of AI. So the first thing for me is that I see learning getting closer and closer to the product itself. So where the line between sort of using the product and learning it will be kind of blurred, essentially. Because today, in many cases, learning is a discrete experience that you do separately from the product itself. But I kind of see that kind of blurring more and more. And I see platforms like Instruqt being a key player there, because again, if people want to learn the product before they do something in there, they might want to see an example of doing it outside of the product just very quickly, or just in the same, with another panel within the product itself. So I think there's a opportunity here for Instruqt to do a lot more in this space. I'm very excited about that. That's one. The second thing I would say is, doing more just sophisticated performance-based learning. So where we can offer ways for people to really fine-tune their skills in a highly customized environment. So an example of that would be, you can in the world of databases, which is the world that we're in, you could walk into maybe a scenario where there's a down production database. Again, it's all simulated, but the point is you simulate that and then let people recover out of it. So being able to really recognize those high touch, high performance learning experiences, I think it's going to be really important. So for me, I think that the predictive nature of AI, combined with going deeper and deeper into the product and using Instruqt and a tool like that to do that, I think that's a really fascinating opportunity actually going forward.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I think obviously it touches on sort of the central point where we find a lot of our customers get value from from
Yeah.
Instruqt in general. So that hands-on nature that can be applied so many different versatile situations. Yeah. All right. So I'm going to jump to this one, Q&A. Let me just thank you, Raghu. I think there is one question that I'm getting prompted here. If you can share, what are the different options that Mongo actually explored before Instruqt? I think we're not shy in knowing that our customers are evaluating multiple platforms. Not looking for you to necessarily say anything negative about other platforms, but I'm curious, what was your sort of evaluation process like when you were looking for a hands-on solution?
Yeah, so it was 3 years ago, so I don't remember every single company name from then. And I'm happy to share it offline if someone would like to reach out to us. Um, yeah, the evaluation process is very simple. It's like I said before, we wanted to have the ability to connect with our core platform. That was really, really important to us. The
Yeah.
second thing was the UI. The third thing was actually just the variety of use cases that we can put in. And again, I'm not trying to dodge the question. I don't actually remember
No, that's
exactly
fine. Yeah.
different vendors. And I'm not trying to dodge it, but I'm happy to provide that list if someone would like to reach out to me directly. I'm happy to offer that.
Yeah, and I mean, we obviously we have just in general when we bring on new customers, we understand that customers are evaluating a lot of platforms, and we have a very involved process that we help with a lot of our customers to create, example content, create POCs, which I'm sure we did. I wasn't here either necessarily when you guys started using Instruqt and you guys evaluated us, but we're very aware of the needs of the customers. So.
Yeah. The one
Yeah,
thing,
we
if
can
I may add to
appreciate
that
that.
answer, one thing that just cropped up in my mind is that's recent is that we had a group that was using Strigo, by the way, as a
Mhm.
platform. And so we did, and so they switched from Strigo to Instruqt again because of everything we just talked about.
Right.
So that was one platform we did look at. There were two others in the list too.
Okay. Cool. That's good to know. Let's see. Any other questions from the group? If not, I know there's a few more. What advice? Obviously, we've talked a little bit about where things started to where they are today. I'm curious, what advice would you give for somebody who's starting from scratch today? I think we went through the whole evolution. Obviously, it's happened over multiple years. If you could go back and give yourself maybe a piece of advice, what would you tell yourself a few years ago when you got started?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the first step of it is I think it's important to have a vision for learning. I think that's really important. And showing the C-suite or your key decision makers in the company, what I call the art of the possible, which is what can we do with learning? And, how can people learn directly? How can it impact, say, support or consulting or other groups, and how you can make them successful? I think that high level pitch is probably pretty important. And in my case, actually, what I did was I actually created mock-ups of exactly what the learning experience would look like. So this is all done in Figma, one of these UI tools. And
Right.
the thing about sharing some UI is that it gets people thinking. It's visual, right? And they can kind of see, oh, this is what you mean. It's one thing to write a long document, which people may or may not fully comprehend, but it's one thing to show it and story tell it. I think is really, really important. So that would be the biggest advice that I can give you is really have that talk track pulled together in terms of how you want it to look like. And I've told the story before where when I did the mock-ups for MongoDB, this is a true story. I was actually in a taqueria and I actually wrote it down on a napkin. Is basically what I did, and then I asked one of our UI designers, so can you take this napkin doodle, which is basically a doodle, and basically turn it into something nice, and she did an amazing job, I should say. And so so I had my taqueria design, like I like to call it, and then I had what ended up being was not exactly that, of course. There were changes along the way, but what it did was it set a baseline for what things can look like. So that visual
Yeah.
demonstration of the art of the possible, I think, is really, really important, and people get excited about that because otherwise education can be a bit dry. People say, yeah, you're doing courses, and yeah, you're doing labs, and yeah, everybody gets that intuitively, but
Yeah.
showing the experience that's the magic. That's where it's at. So that would be the big thing that I would say that's really, really
Yeah.
important.
Well, luckily for the people getting started today, they don't have to maybe do the back of the napkin taqueria sketching, there's actually AI tools that will create those UI visuals or even multiple kinds of visuals just based on a basic prompt. So yeah, that's some great advice, is to really show people rather than just
Yeah.
telling people what it's gonna look like. So a couple more questions have come through. You talked a little bit about personalization of content. I'm curious how, and the audience is curious how you've done personalization thus far with the content at MongoDB.
Yeah, so it's a great question. Thank you for that, by the way. And so the way we personalize content so far is by role. Because in our world, we have developers that we cater to, we have security professionals, we have operations people, and then we also have architects. Those are some of our core audiences that we have. And so our concept of personalization has been providing learning paths for them based on their particular role. And that's largely worked. That's a concept that's been around for a long time in the industry. So and so what you do then is you sort of self select into which role you are, and then you kind of go down that path from there. And that served us really well. And I think and what I'm suggesting now is that there's another whole level of personalization, which is that you as an individual, regardless of your role, can say, pick and choose what content you want to learn and have AI summarize it for you. So that's the new frontier of learning. But today we do it the way I just described.
Yeah, I mean, I think you could also envision a scenario for AI to assess somebody's skill level, or for somebody to input their skill level and then have AI adjust the content to match their skill level, recommend different starting points. So there's a lot of possibilities there now that I know you and others will be exploring. One more question. So what role does learner feedback play in shaping your curriculum for within the university? And if you have an example top of mind, maybe that has led to a major change within the university, or any change within the university.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Learner feedback is huge, by the way, for us. So as I mentioned before, one of our North Star metrics is quality of our learning. And the way we do that is every video and every lab through Instruqt, and every video we have has a 5-star rating scale that goes with it. And so you as a learner can basically, consume our content and then choose what rating you want to give it. Along with that rating, we actually allow you to enter feedback on what you think you'd like to see done differently. And so we have literally thousands of pieces of feedback every single month on the content in terms of, this idea, that idea, and so on and so forth. So we're very passionate about collecting the feedback. We're very comfortable essentially kind of doing that. So I would recommend that as a core capability of your business, to always do that. Be grounded in what learners want, because it's easy to get disconnected from learners, and this is a very grounding way to sort of do things. So in terms of, how this has influenced us, I would say that a couple of things. One is we've had examples where people have said, this piece of content is probably better taught through a hands-on lab, for example. So maybe the initial modality we led with wasn't quite right, where instead of a video, they just want to see a lab, on this particular subject.
Right.
We've also seen it in reverse, where sometimes we have a lab and someone will say, hey, you should have an extra video that goes with it to explain the concept as to why. So really kind of that has been really important. The other piece of it, I would say, is, we've through the feedback, we've created genres of content. And what I mean by that is, we initially went to address our developers, but very quickly we got questions that were operations related and security related. So that inspired us to create operations content, security content, and architecture content. So and then we got inspired about certification and skills. So we knew a lot of it going in, but the feedback definitely guided us along the way. What we also do outside of just that kind of feedback is we also do regular surveys with our users, and we just collect general feedback about what they think about the overall learning experience. So we collect this feedback in a couple of different ways. And then the last thing I'll say is that learning comes up as a subject at our customer advisory boards. So this is where we meet with our top customers and we talk about, just everything that they want. And one of the subjects is learning and enablement. Do they feel like their teams are really enabled or not? And so that's another area where we get visibility. So I would just be very comfortable collecting feedback. I think it can be humbling at times, but but I think it's very grounding and it's very important.
Yes, as they say, feedback is a gift. So
It is.
be willing to accept it, whether it's a gift you want or a gift you don't want.
That's right. That's well said.
Raghu, thank you very, very much for your time. I know this, your time is valuable, and I know it, sparing an hour is not always easy, but we appreciate it. You guys are great customers. You are a great champion, obviously, for Instruqt, and thank you very much.
And thank you also. I really enjoyed the chat, and and just in return, we've really enjoyed our partnership with Instruqt. It's been great. So thank you.
Awesome. Well, have a good rest of your day, and have a good rest of your day to everybody who's listening and watching. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.